Lesson 18, Anatomy, Locomotive System, Neck Muscles. The neck is a very important structure. It contains very important organs and vessels, and of course, it also has an extremely important bone, muscle, and joint structure. The neck skeleton is made up of the cervical spine, about which we have already discussed above, while its muscles are divided in several classes. The posterior muscles, which are present in a deep layer and a superficial layer. The deep muscles are the intrinsic muscles of the spine, while the superficial ones will be discussed among the extrinsic muscles of the chest. So we are going to focus on the anterior muscles of the neck, which are divided into suprahyoid, subhyoid, lateral muscles. As you may have already guessed, this division leads to the hyoid bone, which, if you remember, we mentioned in a previous video. The key function of the hyoid bone is not to protect the neck, but rather to provide a connection point for all, or almost all, the neck muscles. Let's start with the suprahyoid muscles, in particular with the digastric one. As its name implies, the digastric muscle has two bellies, separated by an intermediate tendon, which you see here in white. The digastric posterior belly is the longest one. It origins at the level of the mastoid fossa of the temporal mastoid process and goes down and medially to insert itself in the intermediate tendon, which is connected to the upper face of the body of the hyoid, more or less at the point where the great horns branch off. Here begins the anterior belly, which instead goes forward, inserting itself in the digastric fossa on the posterior face of the mandibular body, approximately at the level of the most prominent part. The intermediate tendon and the digastric anterior belly are involved in forming a triangle of surgical aggression, called the lingual artery triangle, which we will discuss more in detail when dealing with the neck topography. With its contraction, the digastric muscle raises the hyoid bone, lowers the jaw, and extends the head. Let's now turn to the stylohyoid muscle. The stylohyoid muscle originates from the styloid process of the temporal bone, leads down and medially to insert itself on the body of the hyoid bone, more or less exactly at the same point where the intermediate tendon of the digastric muscle is inserted. A detail which you can see here is that this tendon branches off to incorporate the intermediate digastric tendon, forming an unusual structure. By its action, this muscle pulls the hyoid bone up. Let's move on to the two very important mylohyoid muscles that, as you can see, are large, oddly shaped sheets that take part in the composition of the oral cavity floor. The two muscles originate along the mylohyoid fossa of the level of the body, inner face of the jaw, and then lead down and medially, joining at the midpoint along a structure called the mylohyoid raphe. The raphe is the intersection point of the tendinous fibers of the two muscles. This starts at the level of the jaw internal face, at the chin, and runs almost all the way along the oral cavity floor, ending on the body anterior face of the hyoid bone, where it widens to anchor itself to it. By contracting, the mylohyoid muscle brings the hyoid bone forward, raising it and lifting the tongue, cooperating in the highly complex process of swallowing. Finally, there is the last suprahyoid muscle, which is the genial hyoid. As you can see, it's this even and symmetrical muscle and origins from the internal mental spine, reaching the anterior face, the superior margin of the hyoid bone. The movement of this muscle brings the hyoid bone forward and upwards, but if it pivots on the hyoid bone, it lowers the jaw. Let's now look at the subhyoid muscles. As the name implies, they are all located below the hyoid bone. One of the most extensive is certainly the sternal hyoid muscle. a long and ribbon-shaped muscle which origins from the posterior face of the manubrium of the sternum, from the sternoclavicular joint and the medial end of the clavicle, to then move upwards and medially taking relations with the larynx and reaching the external half of the lower face of the hyoid bone at body level. With its action, it lowers the hyoid bone. There is then a digastric muscle here too, called omohyoid. It origins at the levels of the internal face of the superior margin of the scapula. With the first belly, it continues in an intermediate tendon which crosses the vascular nerve bundle of the neck and then goes up with a second belly which leads in a ribbon-like form on the first part of the great horn of the hyoid. With its action, it lowers the hyoid bone. Then we have the sternothyroid muscle, which we can see better by making transparent the sternohyoid muscle, which stretches in front of it. This is another ribbon-shaped muscle. Its origin is roughly similar to that of the sternohyoid. It stems, in fact, from the inner face of the manubrium of the sternum, from the sternoclavicular joint, but it also origins from the first part of the first rib, inserting along the oblique line of the thyroid cartilage, which forms the anterior wall of the larynx. With its action, it lowers the thyroid cartilage and therefore the larynx. There is then the thyrohyoid muscle, which origins at the level of the oblique line of the thyroid cartilage, reaching the lower face of the hyoid bone, at the border between the body and the great horn of the hyoid. With its action, it raises the larynx or lowers the hyoid bone. Finally, we have the lateral muscle group. These muscles are divided into 3 layers. The most superficial one, which includes the platysma, an innervation muscle similar to the mimic muscles. In fact, it can be considered a mimic muscle. You have to imagine this muscle as a wide and thin plate that, originating from the second rib, goes to the skin of the cheek. This muscle, with its action, contracts the skin of the cheek and lowers the jaw. Furthermore, there is a middle muscle, which is the sternocleidomastoid, a large fleshy lamina, composed of 2 heads at the origin and 1 at the insertion. The sternal head origins at the level of the outer third of the sternal manubrium and is rather thick, while the clavicular head is more laminar and origins from the inner quarter of the clavicle. The 2 heads join into one large muscular belly, which then generates a large tendon that inserts on the mastoid process of the temporalis and on the outer third of the nuchal line of the occipital bone. When contracted, this muscle flexes and tilts the head sideways, making it rotate in the opposite direction. Let's take a look at the deepest lateral muscles, which are 3 scalene muscles. The anterior scalene comes from the transverse processes, anterior lamina of the 3rd to 6th cervical vertebrae, to insert on the scalene tubercle that is located on the first rib, approximately at the level of the anterior portion. The middle scalene, on the other hand, origins from the transverse processes of all the cervical vertebrae except for the atlas, which it origins from the posterior lamina of these transverse processes. It always inserts on the first rib, but more laterally, almost at the level of the projection of the middle axillary line. Finally, the posterior scalene stems from the last 3 cervical vertebrae at the level of the posterior laminae of their transverse processes, to insert on the lateral part, upper margin of the second rib. The 3 scalenes, when contracting, have 2 possible actions. They tilt the cervical spine laterally, making pressure on the rib, while if they force on the cervical spine, they raise the thorax, thus functioning as inspiratory muscles. Topographical detail should also be mentioned. That is, that the middle anterior scalene with the first rib forms a triangular space through which the subclavian artery, the subclavian vein, and the brachial plexus pass.
This video was created thanks to Anatomy Learning, an interesting free web app. The hyperlink can be found in the description. Instead, the text used for the concepts is Human Anatomy of Eddie Hermes. Thanks for watching.